Good evening, everyone. It's very lovely to see you all here. I am standing in for Kathy Silva, who would have been here to host this session this afternoon, but unfortunately couldn't make it. But I'm really pleased to be able to stand in for her because I've known Julie for
a few years.
About 25 years. And therefore, I'm really delighted to be able to welcome her to the department today. So Julie is Professor of Psychology and Special Needs at UCL's Institute of Education and qualified as both a clinical and educational psychologist. Her research interests are in patterns of language development and the ways in which oral language skills impact on children's learning, interaction, and attainments. A central theme in her research has been the application of evidence-based research to support children's learning through interventions, enhanced language learning environments, and professional development. She's published in a wide range of journals and written books and book chapters on language development and language difficulties. She was the previous editor of the British Journal of Educational Psychology, associate editor for the Journal of Speech, Language, and Hearing Research, and also Learning and Instruction. She was a co-director of the Better Communication Research Program in the UK and is currently PI on a Nuffield-funded project examining universal language support for nursery-age children in areas of social disadvantage, and is also the co-I for the Education and Cognition stream for the UKRI GCRF Action Against Stunting Hub,
well done.
LMNOP, lots of acronyms. She served, here are more acronyms coming up. She has served on 2 RAE panels and government committees. Previously was deputy chair of the BPS Research Board, treasurer and chair of the BPS Developmental Psychology section. And in 2023, she was awarded the Outstanding Contribution to Developmental Psychology Award by the BPS Developmental Psychology section. That's really been amazing. She has also been a longtime friend of this department and has collaborated with many of us, including me, when she graciously collaborated with me on my first ever ESRC grant on word finding difficulties in young children. But she's collaborated with Sandra, Kathy, and many others within the department. And she's regularly supported what we do here, most recently by serving as the external on our recruitment panel for our recently appointed RS4 in Special Educational Needs and Disability in Child Development. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Julie Dockrell to our department this evening.
Thank you very much, Vicky, and thank you for the introduction. And thank you for those who've come this evening or are online this evening and listening to what I have to say. What I want to try and do tonight is something a little bit different, and I really want to try and stimulate a debate about how we think about links between research and practice, and then maybe think a little bit about a potential framework, something that I found useful, to be honest, retrospectively in looking at how work can impact on practice. To do this, I'll obviously draw on some of my own research, and I do that with an awareness that I'm probably the best person to know both the strengths and the limitations of what I've done with my colleagues in the past. So I have a plan today doing about 5 things. I want to talk a little bit about this field called implementation science. And I want to think about how an implementation science framework could work to guide work on oral language. So I'm speaking about oral language because that's something I know a little bit about, but I think it's also relevant to think about other areas in education and learning. To do that in terms of oral language, I'm going to have to convince you of the importance of Oracy skills. I'm going to look at how teachers engage with the construct of Oracy, and I'm going to think about what the components of oral language at school entry are. So that's what's important in terms of looking at these links with oral language. I'm then going to move on to the issue about implementation and how we support children that are struggling with language. So I'm going to look at Oracy skills on entry to school and children in areas of social disadvantage, and some of the work we've tried in implementation to support children's oral language. And finally, I'm going to address briefly some of the challenges that I think implementation science bring to us as researchers. All right, well, what do I mean when I talk about implementation science? Well, basically, these are methods that are out to promote the integration of research findings and evidence in policy and practice. Okay, so that's the key link. It's not just me saying that, well, I've done this little study, you know, the government ought to listen to it. It would be great for the new Labour government. I don't know. It's a field that's been around for a long time, particularly in agriculture, industry, and predominantly in the most recent years around health and health-related practices. But education's been really slow to enter the arena here. To the best of my knowledge, the first and only research institute that looks at implementation science for education is at the University of Washington as the RISE group, and that itself is fairly recently. So it's not entirely clear to me why we've been so behind when actually a lot of what we would do is important for educational policy and practice. So why would we bother about implementation science? Well, I think there's a number of reasons. And the first thing is that if you look at implementation science, what it's designed to do is address the gap between research and practice. It's to put the most effective programs and policies in the hands of the people who need them and the people who matter, not the academics that are sitting in the offices. It examines the barriers and the strategies and potential levers of change. So one of the things that's really challenging in my field is that you get a lot of small-scale studies. They show a bit of an effect, but actually when you take them out much more widely, they don't work. So what is it that's wrong there about what we're doing? And so my buts come from medical science, really. So we don't have the data on education. I doubt it'd be much different to this. That there's a 17-year delay for research implementation in medical sciences. And even then, only 14% of them have an impact. And in terms of the return on investment, 80% of medical research dollars do not make a public health impact. So we might want to think about how many education or psychology research dollars make an impact there. Okay, so what's our route? Where do we go? So when you take it, where do you start? Well, that was a bit of a brick wall for me, because actually there are 100 different frameworks for research on implementation. It's a great website. You can go through them all. Where should we take it forward? I mentioned that there's only the educational engagement one, the RISE project. They have some very interesting videos, but you still struggle a little bit with that. So I've come up with one that I will use, but we have to realize, or I want to think about the fact that what we're thinking about here are scientific methods to promote systematic uptake of research findings and other evidence-based practices to improve the quality and effectiveness. This is about health services, but this would be about education services, learning and development, right? So my question is, how might this work in understanding children's challenges in language development? So here's a bit of the retrospective bit. You know, if I had started here, the story might be a bit different, but I didn't. So in terms of implementation, impactful research has to be underpinned by an understanding of the complexity of development, child development, in an evidence-informed way. We have to embed what we know and learn within this framework, this implementation science framework. And the first steps in doing that is establishing relationships between core constructs, why this is important. So the framework that I'm going to use, and the one that I found most helpful, maybe because it's the easiest one to look about implementation, is this one from the Harvard Catalyst Group, which is a translational research continuum. So you've got 4 steps in real world development. So you've got your pre-intervention, where you're looking at relationships between factors. You've then got your efficacy studies. Could a program work? You've got your effectiveness studies. Does a program work? And finally, you've got your implementation studies. What makes the program work in real world settings? And I think that's critical in terms of what we need to think about. Okay. So I'm going to work through these stages to talk in relation to oral language to highlight some of the challenges and why it's important to look at these things. So the first thing I want to ask is about is there a relationship? And the relationship here I'm asking about is really, why is oral language important? What does it underpin? Yes, that's what I've made my career around, oral language, but then people make careers around lots of areas. But these are the cases I think that you have to make. Right. So I think there are a number of points. There's about 5 areas that oral language is key to in development. It encourages the development of cognitive skills. So this is not my own work, but I'm setting a framework. I'll give you an example from my own work to take it slightly further. It promotes socio-emotional regulation, impacts reading comprehension and writing. It's essential for learning in school and accessing the curriculum. And in the long term, language and communication skills, poor language and communication skills can limit access to jobs and training. So basically, this is important. And a child's language skills, according to Dickinson and Bush, more strongly predict 3rd grade reading comprehension than parent income, ethnicity, level of parent education, and you can make the list from there. So I would argue that there's a relationship between oral language and learning, and the particular quick example I'm going to do from some work that I've done with colleagues in the past is look at children's production of written texts. And when I started this research, oral language really didn't feature in when they looked at children's development of their writing and the problems they might have. So this was a small study we did some years ago, 90 primary school children aged between 8 and 10. And we did what people in writing research would do. They would look at the things that was out there that predict children's production of written text. Nonverbal ability, reading's a key feature, how well they can spell, how good their handwriting is, writing processes measures, which is sort of a planning and revision. And we stood back at that time and said, okay, well, what about oral language? How does oral language feature in this for these children? And in this study, we used a couple of measures. One was a receptive vocabulary measure. The other was an expressive language measure. And I can make the case why I chose them. Again, with hindsight, it's a wonderful thing. If I went back, I might have chosen different measures to look at, but we didn't. Right. But we had quite a complex measure of writing that we thought would make sense to teachers in educations and learning contexts. So the children wrote, and their text products were assessed in terms of the quality of what they wrote, the grammatical accuracy of what they produced, and the lexical diversity. So how many different words, what kind of words were in these texts? So I'm going to just present some very simple data looking at regressions, papers published, so you can go and look at it yourself. The bottom line is that across all writing assessments, oral language contributed significantly. But I'll take you through them. So we've got holistic quality, grammatical accuracy, and lexical diversity. So in these regressions, we first put in age, even though it's a small age band. We know that children get a little bit better with age. And yeah, for all of them, a little bit of variance. Reading and spelling, which is what our educators were very motivated about in terms of how much that impacted on the children's text productions. Well, again, much more variance accounted for across all of the different measures that we had at that time. Handwriting, yes, but less so. There's planning and revision that we had assessed in the task. Again, that was important. Online planning and revision mattered. But on every single measure, what we had assessed in oral language added significantly to the variance about these children's written texts. So if you look at relationships and why it's important, I'd say oral language is core in terms of written expression, text comprehension, children's vocabulary, and their development of phonics and spelling. What about teaching and learning then? Okay, if I made this case, it's important what happens in educational context. What do we know about that? Well, We know that teachers face challenge, children too, but teachers also face challenges in relationships to Oracy skills. So this is some work we published a while ago. It's a very simple survey of over 200 teachers. And what we found was that teachers reported insufficient training, lack of understanding around oral language, a lack of clarity about how they would identify a child in their class who was struggling with oral language, and finally, really were unsure about what they would do to provide support. So this was a reasonable sized survey of children, teachers who are teaching from reception to primary school. And you could say, well, actually, it's not so important when they get to primary school because they'll have done their oral language development. This is what builds up in the early years, and particularly in areas of social disadvantage. So we have data that looks at early years teachers and what they found, what they were reporting in nursery settings. Well, nearly 60% of them had no training, no CPD in oral language in the last 5 years. Of those that had training, most of them, about half of them, were inset, have a cup of tea and hear a lecture by somebody coming to do about that. That's what they knew about oral language. So we seem to have a bit of a disjuncture here, I'd say, between the importance of oral language and what teachers know and understand about oral language. So some years ago, a colleague of mine at IOE, Jane Hurry, we looked at how this knowledge might impact on teachers' identification of children with speech, language, and communication needs. And we used data from the Millennium Cohort studies, which many of you will be familiar with. And we looked at teachers' identification of children's needs at the ages of 7 and 11. And we used some very fancy, or Jane used some very fancy regression models to get these results. And what we found was that teachers' identification of children's needs at 7 and 11 were mostly parent report and vocabulary. And this is important when you think about what we mean by language, but vocabulary was what that was important at that point. Prevalence rates at age 7 were very similar to what you get in smaller clinical studies. And so when I say smaller clinical studies, I'm talking about 50 to 60 children rather than these very large samples. So that was kind of okay. However, by the age of 11, teacher concern had completely dropped. Okay. And this reduction is not found in clinical studies. If anything, in clinical studies, people will say by the time a child is 6, their language problem will continue, and it will be very difficult to modify that. So what's the gap? And this is going to matter if we go back to how we implement interventions. Well, there are a lot of potential reasons about why that is be the case. Maybe children's language difficulties are less evident in educational settings. Maybe we simply don't have reliable and valid measures to benchmark children's language development, capture profiles of performance, and that's absolutely the case. We do not. Maybe this focus on vocabulary and the word gap is problematic, because language, as I'm going to show you, is more than just vocabulary. Teachers are less confident, that's for sure, about what constitutes oral skills in comparison to literacy skills, particularly since the big drives around literacy skills. Okay, so I made the case that there's this gap. Well, what are the key Oracy skills that teachers should be cognizant of? What should be they aware? What should they be thinking of? Well, this is another project that I was involved with, which was looking at oral language skills as children enter school. And the question was, well, what are the key measures what should we be looking about our oral language development? What do children develop? So this was a sample of over 200 monolingual children. So we particularly chose monolingual children for this study, where we captured initially dimensions of oral language between the ages of 4 and 6. We used a broad range of language measures which tapped both oral language comprehension and production. And then we followed them up over 2 years, well, sort of over 2 years. We had a bit of COVID in between that sort of did not a very nice job for our data collection. However, we still are going. So before I actually show you the results, have a think. If you had to define oral language, or if you had to think about what the key oral language skills were, components were for children entering school, that you were going to talk to teachers about, what would they be? Would you focus on vocabulary and syntax? Would you be the kind of person that looks at semantics, pragmatics? What would it be? Well, all of these areas were assessed in the measures that we use, and what we found was a very neat little 3-factor solution at the baseline data. So these are children between the ages of 4 and 6. So there was a factor that we called phonology, which had to do with the sound systems of the language. There was a factor which we called structural language, which had to do with vocabulary and grammar. And there was a factor that had to do with narrative skills. And that's really important. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because that's something that's been missing, and actually something that's important in predicting how much children can write. But if you think of our big impact, not our research, but generally about our impact on policy and practice, well, in the UK, there's been a focus on phonics, driven from some very good work, and I'm not going to argue about that, about reading, followed up by a bit of a vocabulary. So, 15 years ago when I taught my master's course in child development, nobody'd heard of the word gap. Now they all know about the word gap, and they may not be clear about why children have a word gap, but they've heard that word about vocabulary. In terms of narrative, narrative is actually quite important, and it showed very clearly in our data that this use of extended and connected discourse was challenging for some children, but important for a communicative purpose. And it helps children in thinking and moving from what I'm going to call context-dependent thinking to context-independent thinking. The interesting thing here is that understanding narratives was not the same as being able to produce narrative. And again, if you think of teaching context and education context, that's challenging because you don't necessarily get an opportunity to do both of those. Okay. So what does that mean about how we then take our data, our evidence base, and embed it within interventions? So my argument is that we have to target structural language. So that's both vocabulary and grammar. We need to think about narrative skills. And we have to do this while demonstrating an awareness of teachers' needs. If teachers don't understand what language is about, or that it's important, or how it impacts into performance, then, I can stand up and talk for as long as I like. It's not going to make much difference. So, first part of my talk, I hope I've convinced you that language matters. I hope I've explained that teachers are not well prepared to address language challenges. And there's no reason they should be. I mean, I do the 1 hour they get and their teacher training on oral language. That's it, but also within that framework, language is actually quite complex. Okay. So in terms of my implementation assignments, I've talked about there's a relationship. I hope I've convinced you that there's something worth taking forward here. I now want to think about the next step about this, which is, could a program work? Okay. And I'm going to use this framework of talking about language nutrition, about getting it right early on. So what are the drivers of oral language? So this is a quote which I'm very fond of, which is about, language nutrition is an environment which provides sufficient exposure to language to facilitate or nourish a child's brain. Okay? Same way that we have the right kind of food. It's an early language exposure that is rich in both quantity and in terms of the quality of what's given. So it's data-driven. So this rich environment involves talking, interacting, or reading with a child in something that I am going to call the serve and return interaction. Okay, so it's not me. I mean, this has to be the worst kind of context for learning language you could come about, because there's no exchange between us about what's going on. Hopefully there'll be a bit of exchange afterwards, but at the moment, in terms of learning oral language, this isn't so very good. Okay. Unless you know what's happening in these settings, there's no point trying to develop a new intervention. So what's out there? What are the classrooms like? What are the early years settings like? So again, you're taking what's happening in the real world setting and looking at it in relation to oral language. So as part of the Better Communication Research Program that Vicky mentioned, we developed a tool, which my colleague James Law used to call the CSCOP, which is about capturing, communicating, supporting classrooms. So this is an evidence-informed tool. It's not just that, it's nice to talk. It's an evidence-informed tool which captures 3 dimensions. One is the language learning environment. So these are what research evidence has told us that are prerequisites to allow teaching and learning around oral language. So we're talking about quiet corners, labeling the books, those sorts of opportunities in those settings. The second aspect in CSCOP is what I'm going to call language learning opportunities. So one of the particular examples here is a small group. Do the children get an opportunity to talk in a small group with each other? Is interactive book reading used? One of the most effective interventions that we know out there. That does that happen in a classroom? Is everybody included, or is it just a few children? And how is that done? And the final one is language learning interactions. Now, if you could think about this as the how of teaching. But actually, I'm going to say this is the driver. And this is effective ways in which teachers talk with children. And it goes from everything from using their names, so, hi, Vicky, shall we do this? To recasting and scaffolding. I'm going to give an example, which is probably my favorite from doing this whole project. Is I was observing as year 2 handwriting classroom, many of which I observed were very quiet. Nothing was going on of much interest. And this teacher used it as a way of modeling language. So he had his group of children, and it was a he. And he said, okay, so today we're going to learn, I can't remember what the letters were, L. And we have to start at this specific point on the page. And then he turned to a little girl and said, I'm going to come back to you in a minute to ask what we're doing here. Then he taught them through the big loop and the dots and so forth. And he went to another child. That child reported, and then he went to the little girl who clearly needed more time to talk it through. So it's about language interactions, supporting what's happening in those contexts. Right, so what did we see? So the blue graph is our representative sample, in a loose sense of the word, but it captured different types of settings. And the orange one is some recent work, which is just about to come out in press, collected by Sandra, my PhD student, and Kitty Dobinson, which looks at social disadvantage settings. So the question is, are these different, and what sorts of things do we find? Well, the first thing you find is that in English classrooms, on the whole, the language learning environment is really pretty good. They don't need any more books. There are quiet corners. They don't need anything else like that. I would never expect a score of 100 there, because classrooms vary in terms of what's out there. We get variation. That's exactly what you'd expect. But language and learning environments tend to, on the whole, be good. Slightly less good in areas of social disadvantage. Language learning opportunities, well, actually, they don't actually happen very much, which is a bit surprising if you want to drive language learning. But again, you have this pattern where if they happen, they're happening slightly more in our representative sample. These language learning interactions, of which there are 20 in the checklist to look at, which I'm going to argue are the driver, are actually happening more in our areas of social disadvantage. So the first thing about that is, I suppose, not to make assumptions or judgments about what's happening out there. And if you're going back in, if I'm working in areas of social disadvantage, I can't make assumptions. I need to think about what it is that I'm working and developing. Okay. what about Oracy skills on entry to school, onto school? So that, you know, I mean, I can say what I like, but if it's not really a challenge, or it's just in, you know, people are just saying it's got worse, we need to have some empirical data about this. So we had the opportunity to collect some data pre-COVID to look at this. And the basic issues here is that we have marked variability and clusters of need within and across groups of disadvantage. There, you know, it is not this simple correlation. We need to look at the dynamics of what's happening there. In the areas of disadvantage that we looked at, so we had over 800 children in the lowest quintile of deprivation in areas around London and around the Northeast. And I want to highlight their patterns of performance on these standardized language measures. And we also included children who had English as an additional language. If you work where I do in London, in Tower Hamlets, there's no point trying to go in and find monolingual children because you get one per school. So excluding them in an intervention study means or profiling language is not very representative, probably the most polite way of putting it. Okay, so I want to talk about what kinds of level of need we're looking at in terms of these disadvantaged groups. And although I'm going to be using effect sizes as my benchmark, I'm also looking at range within these to show that there's a diversity. So let's think about these measures that I picked up earlier that were important to language development. So the first one I'm going to use non-word repetition as a proxy, if you like, for the phonological dimension. And in our areas of social disadvantage, so the lowest quintile, these are disadvantaged settings, you actually get no significant difference between non-word repetition scores in a norm reference sample and the children in these areas. So that wasn't a problem. What about sentence repetition? So this is simply a task where you say a sentence to the child. The boy ran behind, not even this kind of complex, boy ran behind the car, and the child has to repeat it back. Okay, now here we are beginning to see an effect. So the children in areas of social disadvantage, on average, that's the thing, look at my bars, on average, are struggling with sentence repetition. Naming vocabulary, again, the children are struggling, but the biggest differences are around verbal comprehension. So I raise this as a challenge for those children who then move into formal education to access the curriculum and to often be in situations where they have less opportunities to develop their language skills. Okay, so the implications for intervention. Large numbers of children with significant, what I'm going to call as language learning needs. Staff not well prepared to meet these needs, that the knowledge and skill vary greatly between and within schools, suggesting a strong need for some time of continual professional development. The setting is varied, but typically we're not offering strong language learning environments and not offering it to all children. So some years ago, with again another colleague at the Institute of Education, Maura Stewart and I went out and did some work in Tower Hamlets, actually, to look at supporting early oral language skills. And to do that, we did a lot of piloting, we did some talking with staff, and we developed the fledgling intervention, which we called Talking Time. And basically, that was scripted, but a flexible intervention, which was offered twice weekly for 15 minutes. Right? So you could say twice weekly for 15 minutes. Well, we did try and have it more than that, but the staff felt that they could not do this in the nursery settings because they had to focus on the important aspects of phonics and teaching children to read. Okay. These were all done in small group activities, in mixed groups, mixed ability groups. That's very important. And it was a game-like approach to tackle these key areas of language development. So we were focusing on vocabulary, oral language comprehension, which is key, and oral narrative skills. So, go back to those aspects of language that I was saying was important at the time. And we got some indicative evidence this actually could be effective. All right. Well, let's take it a bit further and see how far we can get with this. I was very lucky to be able to collaborate with James Law, who's no longer with us at the University of Newcastle, and Sandra Mathers, who is still with me at the moment, where we had two major research questions, where we looked at whether talking time could impact on the language nutrition the children receive, i.e. what the staff or how they're working with them, and does talking time impact on language growth. We wanted to ask firstly whether it was differentially influenced by what I'm going to call is language status. And these are children who we've debated tremendously about what we're going to describe them as. But these are children who have languages other than English as well, to a different level of degree. So we call them dual language learners. Oops, and I went back that way. Okay. So what we did was we had a cluster randomized trial. We started it pre-COVID, then we had to start again at post-COVID in 40 nursery settings in the lowest quintile of deprivation, London and the Northeast. In the end, we were only able to recruit 36 because of the knock-on effects of COVID. All the children were included within the study, including children that I'm going to call dual language learners. So we had over 600 children at baseline, but it was very tricky doing these testing because it was the first year that schools were really open after COVID, and so we lost a lot. Children settings were randomized into intervention or business as usual groups, and we had baseline data and follow-up data that we aim to capture these different levels of child's language, the practitioner-child level interactions, and parent care reported language use and behavior. Now, I'm saying that, but actually the response from the parents was very limited, so I'm not going to report anything about that. So thanks to Sandra's creativity, the program was enhanced significantly. So talking time was developed. So there's now a structured handbook with detailed prompts and session plans. CPD activities were embedded to support professional knowledge. And the aim was to create, so teachers could move on to create their own plans, in fact, become independent practitioners in adapting the program. The focus on adult learning, this language nutrition to build capacity for effective language learning, language supporting practice in the long term. And as Sandra would say, I'd like to say these were my own words, but she says this is both cost effective and respectful of the teaching profession. Okay. So there was the potential here to enable staff to adapt, to embed and generalize the program's principles, offering these language enriched settings. So it wasn't just a train and hope. We just didn't go in and, have your hours training and go away and hope it all worked. But there was a lot of ongoing support and a lot of video activities with the staff, all run by Sandra and the training team there. Okay, so what do we find? So the first thing is I'm going to focus on is this notion of language nutrition. And the first question, of course, you have to ask, does this change over time? So the program started in January, and then about 11 weeks later it finished. Did teachers change their practice over time? And was there an interaction with the intervention? Was there an intervention effect? In terms of children's language, I'm going to ask the same sort of thing. The first thing I'm going to ask is whether this dual language status mattered at baseline, and if so, in what way? Did the children improve over time on the standardized measures that we gave? So they would have been assessed on these measures before Christmas and then followed up in June. So we had a 7-month window there. So you'd hope there'd be a bit of change. And did the intervention actually make any difference? Okay, language nutrition. So again, this was an innovation where group conversations during book reading were recorded and then analyzed. And they were analyzed in these 4 different areas: how long the interactions went on for, how many utterances occurred in those sessions, the types of utterances that the staff provided, and also the proportion of child talk, whether that changed. Total number of conversations, the types of terms that went on, and then the prompts that were used. Some of you will be familiar with the notion that open-ended prompts are important. So, what about change over 7 months? Well, over 7 months, these got longer, there were more utterances, the adult reading increased, and the proportion of child talk increased, and the turns increased on turns. But there was a significant interaction effect to show that we would argue that language nutrition had changed in the intervention settings, right? And those were about these key measures about duration. The children were talking more in these settings, there were more terms, and also the terms of the proportion of extra textual utterances and prompts that were provided. So they're reading a book, what other language were the staff using in those settings? So we would argue that in this trial, we've got a shift in terms of language nutrition. What about children's language growth? Okay, because ultimately that's what people are hoping will impact. So these measures, okay, so these measures here, we have what I'm going to call control measures. So these are measures that we had no reason to assume that this intervention would impact differentially in the intervention section. There were 2 measures from the British Ability Scale. One was picture similarities. Some of you will be familiar with that. We'll talk about it if you want. Matrices, so these are non-verbal, and non-word repetition. We weren't focusing on any of that. We had some standardized language measures. So we had a sentence repetition task. So we should be remembering some of these from what I was talking about before, a verbal comprehension measure, and we had a naming vocabulary measure. We also introduced these, we call, it was an online test because we were terrified that the trial was going to go belly up again, and we wanted something in the schools that teachers could use if we had nothing else. So this is a quick interactive language scale, standardized in states. It looks at vocabulary, syntax, and processing. And then we had some bespoke vocabulary items. So these were vocabulary items that were chosen from a measure that said, which had age of acquisition. So these were vocabulary items that 3-year-olds should know. All right. And we had half of them were what I'm going to call control, object, and action terms. In that they weren't embedded in they weren't embedded in the books, and the others were target, object, and action. So they were never taught explicitly. This is really, really important. They were not taught. So it was just picked up in the context of the book reading. Right. What about the dual language status? So the children who had English as an additional language. Well, basically, you can see all these green tick marks, which mean that the children who had were multilingual English as additional language, all differed from our monolingual sample. Non-word repetition, please note, was higher in the dual language learners group. All right, all the other ones were lower. So that was something that we had to take into consideration in the analysis. Okay, so the next question is, did the children actually get better over time? Because so these are raw scores, obviously not standardized scores that I'm looking at, and you would expect over time that children would get better. Of interest is that they did not get better on our vocabulary items at all over time. So these ones that you would expect, 3 and 3.5-year-olds, didn't change as far as that was concerned. They got a bit better on the other measures, but not on this Quills test that we think might not be sampling exactly the same thing in English population. They did not improve on the BAS raw scores or ability scores in terms of picture similarities. We can again talk about why that measure might not say what we hoped it would be. So of course, the really thing we're interested in is, did language nutrition impact on language growth? So I've shown that dual language learners struggle on some of these more structural aspects. There is some growth over time. Was there an intervention effect? Well, there was a non-significant trend, which I suppose over the time was important in terms of sentence repetition, which is a good marker of language development. But in terms of our target option, our object and action words, so these were words that just showed up in the books. The teachers didn't know what they were. They were just part of the ongoing activities, the CPD activities that had been developed by Sandra and the team. Okay, so my key messages so far, and I'm just coming to the end, so we'll go back to this implementation science. Oracy skills are associated with an underpinned literacy. Teachers are not well prepared to meet the children's needs or to identify language problems. It's a complex skill, and we have to accept that it's a complex skill that needs to be addressed. Interventions need to target universal settings in areas at risk, and we can talk about that, and develop strong language nutrition. And then we know that teachers can create these strong language learning environments, provided the appropriate support is in place, as ongoing professional development. What about talking time? Well, okay, so talking time covers key components of oral language with flexible professional development. And that was a really key thing in the new development, was the professional development that went on. Its aim is it's a targeted universal intervention. So these are where you go to areas where you think there's a likelihood that children are going to struggle with language. And it can be flexible in terms of the needs of the setting and the sociocultural context. And that's really something that's important. But the impact on nutrition that we provided was not sufficient to impact on growth, just simply was not. Why did we have this insufficient language nutrition? Well, I think partly we have to think about how long this trial went on for. So the children got 2 15-minute sessions a week for a period of about, I think in the end it was 11 weeks we managed to run it for. That's not a lot of input on oral language. So, you know, I'm surprised that in some senses that we even got the effect that we did on vocabulary, but that was their part of was going on. So implementation, this is where we are at the moment. I was going to say, thanks to the EF, we are now in a position, yes, to run a trial, which is about to start in September, hopefully to collect some more data about what's going on. We've learned a tremendous amount, I think, from doing that previous trial that was funded by the Nuffield Foundation. And it's helped us, I think more clearly about what the implementation mechanisms are and should be considered. But these are challenges, I think, that go beyond our work in oral language, and I think reflect what should be going on in a range of different contexts in education. We have to think about adaptation across different socio-cultural contexts. You know, what works in northern Sweden in Umeå might not work in Tower Hamlets, no matter how much it's underpinned by strong evidence. We need to do this while addressing issues about disparities and equity, something that I'm very keen on. And we have to also think about the notion of de-implementation for low value and effective processes. You know, probably just about everybody here has this wonderful information that they hold dear in their heart. Well, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And it's not helpful for teachers to have access to a whole range of things that actually don't work, but they should know that they don't work. And I think done my time. And I want to thank you for your time. I am really indebted to the Talking Time team who are listed there and the colleagues that I've worked with over the years. Thanks.